Hello and welcome to our instructional series of videos. In this installment, we're going to show you how to upgrade or replace the stock PCIe SSD in the late 2014 through mid-2015 27-inch iMac. Replacing the PCIe SSD in these iMacs is an advanced installation with a risk of damage to your screen. It's highly recommended that you watch this video in its entirety before proceeding. If you're unsure about completing this installation yourself, professional installation is available. We've already backed up our data, gathered our materials, shut down and unplugged the iMac, and are working on a soft, static-free work surface. We are now ready to begin. The first thing we need to do is remove the display of the iMac. It's held in place with an adhesive around the edges, which you'll have to cut apart. This can be a tricky process and runs a risk of cracking the display, so you'll need to be very careful. Starting on one of the lower corners, insert the screen removal tool between the glass and the chassis. Take care not to put too much stress on the glass itself or it may crack. Work along all the edges of the iMac. All we're doing is cutting the tape holding the display on, not prying the glass away. The corners might prove to be a little tricky, so you may need to go over them a couple of times. The process can take a little time, so be patient. Once you've worked your way all the way around, you can lay the computer face up on your work surface and attach the suction cups to the upper corners. Do one last check to make sure you've loosened all the adhesive around the edges of the iMac. Then lift the glass partway up using the suction cups. Inside, near the top of the right speaker assembly, you'll need to detach two cables. For the first, simply slide it out of its socket. For the second cable, first lift up on the metal handle to unlock the connector, then slide it out. You can then angle the display the rest of the way up and remove the adhesive holding the bottom of the display. Simply grab the tab on each side of the adhesive strip and slowly pull it towards the center until it comes free. Finally, use your opening tool to slit the last little bit of adhesive along the center, and you should be able to lift the display free and set it aside. Now is a good time to peel up any residual adhesive that remains on the iMac chassis so we can replace it with new adhesive later. Then, do the same for any adhesive on the back of the display. The PCIe SSD is located on the back of the main logic board. In order to reach it, we'll need to remove most of the iMac's internals. First, we'll start with the strip along the lip of the iMac, which is held in place by 9 small Phillips screws which we'll need to remove. You should then be able to slide the piece out of the iMac. Next, we'll move on to the left speaker. Start by loosening the 2 Torx T10 screws holding it in place. Pull the speaker assembly slightly out of the iMac so you can remove the power button cable from its channel along the speaker unit. Then, unplug the power button cable from the power supply board. You can then move the speaker over to the side slightly. Next, we need to remove the hard drive. Remove the two Torx T10 screws holding in the outer bracket of the hard drive. This should allow you to slide the drive and bracket out of the bracket on the other side. Once you've done that, you can lift the drive up slightly and detach it from the SATA cable, allowing you to remove it completely. You can now slide the speaker cable from its socket and out from under the remaining hard drive bracket. You can then remove the speaker completely. Next, we'll remove the fan, which is held in by these three Torx T10 screws. Then disconnect the fan cable by sliding its connector from its socket. Lift up on the fan and slowly peel it from the tape securing it to the heatsink. Then set it aside. Moving on to the right speaker, first loosen its two Torx T10 screws. And move it to the side. This will allow you to disconnect its speaker cable and slide it out from under the capacitors on the logic board. You should then be able to remove the speaker unit completely. For the power board, we first need to remove the power supply signal cable by sliding its connectors from their slots. Then, remove these four Torx T10 screws. You should now be able to pull the lower board forward slightly and up so you can disconnect this larger power connector. There's a small latch on the underside which you'll need to push down on in order to release it. It'll likely be a tight fit, so you may need to wiggle it a bit to get it to come free. There's one last cable to disconnect, located on the underside of the power board. Press down on the latch of its connector and slide it out too. You can now set the power board aside. Now it's time to disconnect the AirPort and Bluetooth cables from the board. In order to keep them in the right order when it's time to reassemble your iMac, place a small piece of tape across all four, holding them in place. You can then disconnect the cables by carefully lifting up on the snap connectors. Disconnect the camera cable by lifting up on the metal latch, then sliding the connector out of its socket. The headphone connector simply lifts up and off its socket. Now we can remove the 6 Torx T10 screws holding the board in place, along with the small captured one located under the board. Next, we need to remove these two T10s holding the heatsink to the chassis. Finally, remove this Torx T25 post. Move the SATA cable from underneath the hard drive bracket and you should now be able to remove the main logic board from the iMac. The SSD module is located here near the I/O ports. To remove the original drive, first remove its Torx T8 retaining screw. Then, slide the drive out of its slot. The new drive will have a notch in its connector. This will line up with a pin in the PCIe SSD slot. Slide the drive into its slot until it's fully seated. Then secure it with its Torx T8 screw. Now we're ready to replace the logic board back into the iMac. Located near the I/O ports are two pins. These two pins will line up with these two slots in the iMac's chassis to help align the board when replacing it. Replace the logic board into the iMac, taking care not to trap any cables underneath. The pins and slots shown earlier will help indicate when the board is properly positioned. Once it is, slide the SATA cable back underneath the hard drive bracket. We can now reattach the board to the iMac, starting with the large Torx T25 post along the side. Then, we can move on to replacing the two Torx T10 screws that hold it to the heatsink. You can then replace the 6 Torx T10 screws that hold the logic board in place. 3 of the shorter screws go in the 3 holes nearest the lip of the iMac. With the last short screw going in the outermost hole near the antenna connectors. The remaining 2 holes get the longer screws. Finally, tighten the captive screw located through the hole in the logic board. Now we can reconnect all the cables to the logic board. For the headphone cable, simply align the 2 connectors and snap them together. Slide the camera cable into its socket, then use the metal bar to latch it into place. Arrange the Bluetooth and AirPort antenna cables over their connectors. The tape will have kept them in the right order. Then snap the connectors together by pushing them straight down. You can then remove the tape and move on to the power supply. Plug the smaller power supply cable near the Apple logo into its socket on the underside of the power supply. Next, attach the larger power cable to the socket that's on the underside of the logic board. You can now set the board back into the iMac so that it lays flat and secure it with its 4 Torx T10 screws. The 2 longer screws go along the innermost edge and the two shorter ones go near the lip of the iMac. Finally, slide the power supply signal cables connectors into their sockets and we're ready to move on to the right speaker. Set the speaker into the iMac so that it sits slightly off to the side and position the cable so that it runs underneath the logic board. Then, plug the connector into its socket. You can then set the right speaker into place and secure it by tightening its two Torx T10 screws. Set the fan into place, making sure it goes underneath the piece of tape hanging off the heatsink. Secure it with its three Torx T10 screws and press down on the tape to seal it to the fan. There should be enough residual adhesive to allow it to stick. Finally, slide the fan connector into its socket. Set the left speaker partially into place so that just the narrow end is under the lip of the iMac. Run the speaker cable under the hard drive bracket and slide the connector into its socket. Next, align the SATA connection on your drive with the one on the iMac's cable and slide the two together. Then, fit the two pins on the drive into the two holes in the bracket. You can now secure the bracket on the other side by using its two Torx T10 screws. The power button cable goes into a groove along the speaker assembly at this point. The solid wrapped cable goes in the groove that runs along the face of the speaker assembly, and then the twisted wire goes in the groove along the side. You can now move the speaker into place. This will allow you to slide the power button cable's connector into its socket. You can now tighten the speaker's two Torx T10 screws. The last thing to replace is the strip along the bottom lip of the iMac. Take one of the Phillips screws and attach one of the corners, rotating the strip into place as you tighten the screw. Then, use the remaining screws to secure the other points. We're now ready to close up. Set the display tape pieces in place according to the diagram that comes with the kit. You'll know their position correctly if all the holes and cutouts line up correctly with the shape of the iMac chassis. Once you've determined all the pieces of tape have been placed correctly, peel off the backing and adhere them to their places on the iMac. You can help line it up by inserting a pointed object through the hole in the tape and using it to line the tape up with the corresponding hole in the iMac's chassis. You can then peel off the backing on the other side to expose the adhesive that will attach the display. Set the display along the bottom edge as flush with the lip and as centered as possible, but don't let it close yet as we need to reconnect the last two cables. Reattach the video cable by sliding the connector into its socket and locking it into place with its handle. Then, simply slide the last connector into its socket. You can now carefully lower the display into place, making sure you have the edges lined up correctly. Gently squeeze along the edges to make sure the adhesive sticks. Use the microfiber cloth to avoid any extra fingerprints. You can now remove the suction cups and clean any remaining marks off your iMac. You can now plug your iMac back in, hook it up, and turn it on.